Hi, I'm Matthias Martins. Welcome to this reading from my book, How to Do Things with Stories. We're on to Chapter 3, Tension. Not every sequence of events is a story. Consider some instructions for baking bread. You put flour and water in a bowl, add yeast, stir it up, let it rise, knead the dough, bake it. That's a sequence of events, but it's not a story. It's still not a story if I translate it to the first person past tense. There are two things that make a story a story. First, it must have tension, a desire for a certain outcome that is shared between the reader and one or more of the characters. Second, there must be some flux in that tension. What this means is that the tension must evolve in the course of the story's events. The presence of change implies uncertainty. In this case, uncertainty as to how events will unfold. This uncertainty is ultimately what pulls the reader in and allows him to be influenced. To turn my baking instructions into a story, all I need to add is a pinch of self-doubt, a soupçon of eagerness to please one's judgmental baker boyfriend. Now there is a stake in the outcome, and the reader experiences it as a story. The uncertain future of a story, viewed from a moment within the story, is a kind of ambiguity. We'll call it ambiguity of path. The kind of path we're talking about is the path of a reader in terms of tension. As the story evolves, characters have their own tension arcs. They come closer to what they want, they are pulled away, their desires shift, and the direction of tension changes. As the reader experiences the story, he shares in these changes to some degree. He empathizes with characters and feels their struggles, shares in their defeats and victories, anticipates things on their behalf. It is uncertainty in the tension arc from the perspective of the reader, not any particular character, that ultimately defines ambiguity of path. What all the ambiguities have in common, whether ambiguity of interpretation, ambiguity of symbolism, or ambiguity of path, is that they compel the reader to choose between several possible ways of experiencing the story. In the case of path, each distinct interpretation is a distinct projection of the arc of narrative tension. If the projections were put into words, they might read like this. Right now, the bank robber is on the run from the cops and has stashed her loot in a sewer. And she will give them the slip. Then she'll get her loot and get away clean. Or, right now, the bank robber is on the run from the cops, and she is going to get away. For now. But she's too cocky. Sooner or later, it's going to catch up to her. In order for the tension on the part of the characters to translate into felt tension for the reader must sympathize with their desires. The character must lack something that the reader wants them to have. But the reader must also be able to imagine multiple arcs for this desire. He must be able to picture the character both getting what they want and not getting it. This is the reason why an unscratchable hero becomes boring, no matter how epic his feats. If the reader never sees him bleed, he will eventually cease to imagine him failing. As a result, the story loses ambiguity of path. The reader's projection is a flat line. And, without some other kind of ambiguity to pique his interest, the reader is unlikely to see it through. On the obverse, if a hero sees even a little injury, that adds interest to a story even if the story belongs to a genre where the hero always wins. This is because the reader's experience of tension has little to do with what the reader consciously believes will happen. They may even already know how the story ends. The alternative outcomes to what the reader expects still live in the reader's subconscious, and they can be brought to mind with even very subtle cues. Let's take a closer look at how the paths of characters create the path of the reader. Remember that the arc of a reader may be very different than the arc of any one character. As an example, think of a story where a character starts out sympathetic. She wants a better world for everyone and fights for those she loves. Sometimes she seems to cause unnecessary harm, but her motives are good, and the reader still wants to see her achieve her goals. But somewhere along her path, she does something that the reader can no longer excuse. Something that reveals something corrupt about her priorities. The reader breaks with her. Suddenly he sees her as the villain, not the hero, wants her to fail, not succeed. And when the climax of the story shows her ultimate failure, it brings everything to a gut-wrenching conclusion where one's memories of the protagonist early in the story echo dissonantly with memories of what she was in the end. There is literally a twist of the tension arc, where the reader's perception of the tension arc turns upside down relative to the protagonist. An effective story requires two closely intertwined features. There must be more than one possible interpretation, and the reader must care which one is true. It is the reader's concern that tugs on the distinct interpretations and draws them into competition. As he fights for one or the other or struggles to choose between them, he becomes absorbed at a deeper level than he does in the normal interpretation of language. He learns more about himself, in much the same way he would if he were forced to choose between careers, or cities, or lovers. Ambiguity of symbolism works the same way. In ambiguity of symbolism, there is tension between interpretations as to what a certain character, event, conflict, etc. most closely resembles in the reader's own life. Different symbolic mappings lead to different stakes in the outcome. Take, for example, a reader's encounter with an apparently minor character. The character is a sort of rascal, a bad boy who likes to scrap. Other characters use their power over him to keep him in check, and the reader starts to sympathize with him and feel that he's being treated unfairly. He starts to connect the character to himself, to identify with the character. Suddenly, the rascal is launched into a position of power. Immediately he uses it to take revenge on his handlers and does evil things to advance his own power. If the transition is believable enough, the reader may then feel an inner revulsion. What is it in me, he may ask himself, that caused me to identify with him? This kind of self-discovering process, caused by ambiguity of symbolism, affects the reader's mind along with ambiguity of path. The third kind of ambiguity, ambiguity of meaning, can also be used to tug on the reader's subconscious. However, it is usually undesirable to attempt to use it outside of a poetic style. The reason to be cautious about ambiguity of meaning is that there is a common conceit in fiction, shared between reader and writer, that her prose is a clear window into the world of the story. When the author hides conflicting interpretations in grammar, she disrupts that conceit. The reader suddenly finds himself looking at the window rather than through it. I once read a fantasy novel where, in the climactic battle, one of the major heroes was locked in a death struggle with a hated minor villain. Unfortunately, because of a glitch in the grammar, it was unclear at the last moment who had sliced open the throat of whom. I certainly had conflicting interpretations, and I certainly did care which was true, but I didn't have a sense of my own inner desires being illuminated, so much as frustration at being left in the dark. I had to wade through a few more pages before I was finally sure that the hero had won and the villain was dead, at which point the satisfaction of knowing this fact was weaker than it might have been. As with so much else in life, there is a balance to be struck. Too much certainty in the language makes the prose bloated, the reader no longer free to interpret, and the writer no longer able to pack worlds of meaning into a few words. However, leave too much out and there is nothing to keep the reader engaged and guide him out of the familiar. He is left in his own company, and the vague muttering of the prose in his head only makes him more aware of it. Accordingly, prose should be concise, communicating the intended meaning as fully as possible in as few words as possible. Doing this consistently is the essence of good style, requiring decades of reading and writing to develop and fully mature. It is fortunate for me that the problem of good style is beyond the scope of this short book. What is important for our purposes is that good style cuts down on ineffective ambiguity. This frees the reader to apply his mind to the important, intended ambiguities that guide him further into the world of the story. The usual caveats apply. The writer cannot control what the reader will make of the material she gives to him. Indeed, the more deeply the story manages to shake the reader, the less predictable the outcome will be. But the framework we have made so far allows us to make progress in two areas: how to shake the reader deeply, and how to shake him in the right direction. This is a good time to move from the influencing frame of writing and consider things from the teaching frame. As we observed at the conclusion of Chapter 1, writing is very similar to teaching. This is even true genetically. The first storytellers were the memorizers of myths, of sacred histories, which they would pass on from generation to generation. These myths encoded not only the tribe's past, but also its values and its knowledge of the world. The modern storyteller is engaged in a similar task. This is true whether she sets out to keep her cultural tradition alive by reciting it in a new context, or to subvert and destroy aspects of her culture that she sees as wrong, or even if she sets out with the dream of founding a new tradition. At a deeper level than the mundane metrics of sales and reviews, her task is to teach. As writers, we can teach by telling or teach by challenging. Art has extraordinary power to teach by challenging, to prod readers into searching for new answers within themselves. In teaching by telling, however, art has no advantages, and several disadvantages, over an essay, textbook, or lecture. When we create tension in a story, the way in which that tension is resolved will show the reader something about their world. What that is depends on their interpretive process, but it also depends on how deeply and honestly we delve into ourselves as we write. For every story we tell is to some degree the story of ourselves, and it is only because of the deep resemblances between humans, as readers and as writers, that we are able to share anything at all. I've been Matthias Martins. Thank you so much for listening to this reading from How to Do Things with Stories. Stay tuned for the next chapter, Questions.